The man who rode into Cimarron, New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1878, did so under a name that was not his own, and the woman who would unmake that careful disguise was standing behind the counter of the only dry goods store in town when he pushed through the door and asked for a pound of flour. Martha Turner had been running Turner's Dry Goods for 2 years by then, ever since her father, Elias Turner, had taken a fever the winter of 1876 and left her the building, the stock, the debt, and the singular dignity of being a woman alone in a territory that did not always treat women gently. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, with steady brown eyes and hands that were perpetually ink-stained from the ledger books she kept with a precision that would have shamed a bank clerk. She was not a woman who startled easily. She had seen drifters come through Cimarron like tumbleweeds, blown in by whatever wind had uprooted them back east, and she had learned to read the particular quality of a man's restlessness the same way she read the weather coming over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. She recognized something in this one the moment he stepped inside. He called himself Cole Reardon. He was perhaps 30 years old, broad through the shoulders with the kind of lean, sun-darkened build that came from years of hard outdoor work. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting, a jaw that needed shaving, and eyes the color of good whiskey held up to lamplight amber with something deeper underneath. He wore a plain working man's coat, trail-worn but clean, and he carried himself with a careful, deliberate quality, as though he was measuring each movement before he made it. He set his coin on the counter for the flour, and Martha wrapped it without hurrying, studying him with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to cataloging people. "You just ride in?" She asked not because she needed to know, but because it was the natural thing to say. "This morning," he said. His voice was low and even, and he did not volunteer anything further. "Looking for work or passing through?" He looked at her then directly, and she saw something shift briefly behind those amber eyes. "Looking for work," he said. "Something steady. I heard the Baxter Ranch takes on hands this time of year." "They do," Martha said. "You would want to ride out the North Road about 4 miles, turn at the split cottonwood. Frank Baxter is particular about who he hires, but he is fair. Tell him Martha Turner sent you." The man she knew as Cole Reardon looked at her for a moment longer than the transaction required, and then he picked up his flour and said, "Thank you, Miss Turner." He was at the door when Martha said, almost to herself more than to him, "It is a good name, Cole, solid, easy to say." He stopped. He did not turn around immediately. She watched the line of his back go very still. "Most names are," he said finally, and went out into the bright spring morning. Martha watched the door settle shut behind him and stood for a long moment with her hands flat on the counter. She could not have said, in those first minutes, what it was that tugged at her. It was not his face, though his face was striking enough. It was something in his voice, a particular quality of cadence, the way he had hesitated the smallest beat before he gave his name, as though he were reaching for something that did not come naturally to hand. She had heard that hesitation before. She thought hard for several days about where, and then it came to her on a Thursday evening while she was going over invoices by lamplight, and she set her pen down very carefully on the desk and sat still with the knowledge of it. Warren Whitfield. She had grown up in Abilene, Kansas, before her father had decided the cattle trade made the town too rough for raising a daughter. She had been 16 years old in 1868, and Warren Whitfield had been 20, the younger son of James Whitfield, who ran a prosperous livestock operation on the edge of town. Warren had not been a close friend, not exactly, but he had been a known face, a part of the fabric of a town that no longer existed in the form she remembered it. She had seen him perhaps a dozen times over those years, always at a distance, always part of the busy commerce of cattle and grass and dust. What she remembered most clearly was his voice, that particular measured quality, unhurried and deliberate, and his eyes, which were a color she had never seen precisely duplicated until a man calling himself Cole Reardon walked into her store and asked for flour. She knew better than to act on the knowledge immediately. This was not Abilene, and whatever had brought Warren Whitfield to Cimarron under a different name was his business, not hers. She understood that people carried things they needed to set down, that the territory was full of men who had walked away from something and were trying to build themselves new. She did not judge it. She merely filed the knowledge away in the careful ledger of her mind and went about her business. He came back to the store 3 days later to say that Frank Baxter had hired him on, and to buy coffee and salt and a new pair of work gloves. He was more at ease this time, or perhaps he was simply tired enough from 3 days of ranch work to have dropped some of his vigilance. He leaned against the counter while she gathered his order, and they talked about the weather, about the grass conditions in the territory, about the quality of Baxter's horses, which she had heard were excellent. He had a dry, quiet humor that surfaced in small ways, a half-smile at the edge of a sentence, a well-placed observation that made her laugh before she was quite ready to. When he left that day, Martha thought, "I will keep this secret. I do not know what it cost him, but I can see that it cost him something considerable. I will keep it." The weeks passed. May became June, and the territory warmed into a dry, luminous heat that turned the mesa grass gold and made the evenings long and copper-colored. Cole Reardon came into the store once a week for supplies, sometimes twice. Martha noticed that he was becoming part of Cimarron in the gradual, organic way that quiet men did, present at the Saturday evening socials at the Grange Hall, reliable at the Sunday services, known to tip his hat to the women and help without being asked when something heavy needed lifting. Frank Baxter let it be known that he was a first-rate hand, that he worked without complaint, and had a gift with horses that bordered on uncanny. Martha also noticed that he was lonely. It was not the obvious, hungry loneliness of a young man far from home. It was something older and more settled, a habitual solitude worn so long it had almost become invisible. He was pleasant to everyone and close to no one. He ate his meals at Clara Hatch's boarding house in the company of the other boarders, but with a book propped against the salt shaker, which was, in Martha's estimation, a fairly explicit announcement that he would prefer not to be drawn into conversation. He rode out in the evenings alone, up into the hills above town, and came back after dark, smelling of pine and sage and the clean cold of altitude. It was on a Tuesday evening in late June that Martha found herself at the edge of town at the same hour he happened to be riding back in from those hills, and they ended up walking together down the main street without either of them having planned it, his horse ambling along between them. "You go up there often," Martha said, and it was not quite a question. "Most evenings," he said. He glanced at her sideways. "You notice that?" "It is a small town," she said simply. "I notice most things." "That seems like it could be exhausting." "Sometimes," she agreed. "Other times it is just useful." They walked a little further in the pleasant quiet of a warm June evening, the town settling around them into its end-of-day rhythms, the blacksmith's fire cooling, the saloon just beginning its nightly warm-up, a dog trotting purposefully down the middle of the street. "What is it that you look at?" she asked. "Up on the hill." He was quiet for a moment. "Distance," he said finally. "I like to look at it." Martha considered this. "You came from somewhere that did not have enough of it." He looked at her then, and she felt the full weight of those amber eyes, and the word she thought of was pierced, because that was rather what it felt like. "You are observant," he said carefully. "I told you," she said, and kept her voice light, kept it easy, because she did not want him to bolt. Small town. That night she lay awake for a long time thinking about distance, and the people who needed to look at it, and she thought about Warren Whitfield, who had disappeared from Abilene sometime around 1874, a fact she had heard mentioned by her father in a letter before Elias Turner's own health began to fail. There had been some trouble, her father had written, though he had not specified what kind. Something to do with a business arrangement gone badly, and a man who had not deserved what happened to him, and a name that had been dragged through it. She had not paid it close attention at the time. She paid it close attention now. July came in with a thunderstorm that flooded the low end of Main Street and knocked the weather vane off the Mercantile. Martha spent 2 days helping to reorganize the floor stock after the water came up through the floorboards, and on the second day, Cole Reardon appeared in the doorway with his sleeves already rolled up and said that he had heard she could use an extra set of hands, and that he had a free afternoon. She watched him work for several hours, moving crates and barrels with efficient, unhurried strength, following her directions without question, never in the way, always useful. He was the kind of man who understood how to occupy space without imposing himself on it, and she found this quality almost unbearably appealing in a practical way, in the way that a well-made tool was appealing. They had supper together that evening at Clara Hatch's table, by simple virtue of the fact that it was supper time and they were both there, and it would have been strange not to sit down. Clara put out beef stew and cornbread and dried apple cake, and there were 4 other boarders at the table, and the conversation was general and comfortable, but Martha was aware throughout the whole meal of the man sitting 2 places to her left, aware of his profile when he turned to answer someone's question, aware of the particular quality of his attention when it swept briefly across her face. After supper, while the others drifted away to their various evenings, Martha and Cole sat on the front porch of the boarding house with 2 cups of coffee that Clara had pressed on them, and the evening came down around them soft and still, and the first stars came out over the mountains. "Tell me something true," Martha said. She had not planned to say it. It arrived out of nowhere, as honest things sometimes did. He looked at her. "That is a strange thing to ask." "I have been called strange before," she said. "Tell me something that is just true, not about the weather or the grass or Frank Baxter's horses." He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked out at the mountains for a long time. The silence stretched, and Martha sat in it without apology, because she had learned that the best way to get a guarded man to talk was simply not to interrupt the quiet he was gathering his words in. "I had a life before this one," he said at last. "It was not a bad life, not entirely, but it got attached to things I could not keep. I had to put it down and walk away." "That takes courage," Martha said. "Some people would call it cowardice." "Some people," Martha said carefully, "are not always right." He looked at her again, and that directness was back, that quality of looking that felt like a kind of interrogation, but not an unkind one. "You ask a great deal of a person," he said, and she thought there was the faintest edge of wonder in his voice, as though he had not expected to find himself being understood. "Only what I think they can bear to give," she said. He was quiet for a moment more. Then he said very softly, "Martha Turner, you are a peculiar and remarkable woman." "I am aware," she said, and they both laughed, and something shifted between them as completely and finally as a door blown open by the wind, and after that nothing between them was quite the same. The summer deepened. They fell into habits without discussing them. The walk after church on Sunday mornings, the Tuesday evening conversations on Clara Hatch's porch, the Saturday afternoons when he helped her carry the week's deliveries from the freight wagon to the storeroom, and she fed him dinner in the small kitchen at the back of the store in return. She learned that he had a gift for fixing things. He repaired the front door hinge that had been troubling her for 6 months, and replaced 3 boards on the front porch steps without being asked. He learned that she was a formidable cook, that she played the piano tolerably well, that she had read every book in the small collection the Cimarron Ladies' Circle maintained in the back room of the church, and that she had opinions about all of them. He did not talk about his past, and she did not ask about it, and the space where that conversation did not happen became increasingly charged with the weight of what neither of them was saying. It was Hattie Benson who brought matters to a head, as Hattie Benson often brought matters to a head, being a woman of 62 who had spent most of her life acquiring information about people and dispensing it at strategic moments. Hattie ran the post office, and she missed very little. On a Thursday afternoon in late August, Hattie appeared at the counter of Turner's Dry Goods with a small package to mail and an expression of bright, purposeful interest that made Martha brace herself involuntarily. "That man of yours is well liked," Hattie said, which was her way of opening a conversation without committing to a particular direction. "Is not my man," Martha said, wrapping Hattie's parcel. "He will be," Hattie said with serene confidence. "I have an eye for these things, but I will tell you what concerns me, Martha. Old Raymond Tuck was in this morning asking after him. Wanted to know how long Cole Reardon had been in town and who had recommended him for work at Baxter's ranch." Martha kept her hand steady. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't keep a register of who arrived when," Hattie said, watching Martha's face. "But Raymond Tuck is a messenger. He does not ask questions for himself. He asks them for whoever is paying him to ask." Martha looked up from the parcel. "Did he say who that was?" "He did not," Hattie said. "But he was riding a good horse, Martha. A horse too good for Raymond Tuck to own himself. And he came from the direction of Santa Fe." After Hattie left, Martha stood very still at her counter and let the implications of this settle. Someone was looking for a man named Cole Reardon, which meant someone was looking for a man who had not been Cole Reardon long enough to have attracted attention under that name. Which meant they were looking for whoever Cole Reardon had been before, and they had tracked that person as far as the territory. She closed the store an hour early, which she had never done in 2 years, and rode out to Frank Baxter's ranch in the long amber light of late afternoon. She found him in the corral, working a young mare on a long line, moving the horse in patient circles with a kind of focused calm that she had come to recognize as characteristic of him in everything he did. He saw her ride up and let the mare slow to a stop, and the expression on his face was complicated glad to see her, and then something else, something more guarded, as he read the urgency in her posture. He came to the fence and she did not dismount because she did not intend to stay long, and she said, low and direct, "Someone came to town today asking questions about you, about Cole Reardon. He came from the direction of Santa Fe and he was riding a horse he could not afford on his own wages." The color did not drain from his face. He was too controlled for that. But something behind his eyes went very still, the way a man goes still when he hears the thing he has been half expecting for a long time. "How long ago?" he asked. "This morning," Martha said. "He was gone by noon." But Hattie Benson noticed, and if Hattie noticed, others will too. He was quiet for a moment, staring at the ground between his boots. Then he looked up at her, and she saw something in his face that she thought might be resignation, and it hurt her in a way she had not been expecting. "Martha," he said, and the way he said her name was different from how he had said it before, softer and more careful, as though it were something he was not certain he had the right to. "You do not have to tell me anything," she said. "I am telling you what I know so that you can decide what to do with it. That is all." "Why?" he asked. "Why would you ride out here for that? You do not know anything about me." She looked at him for a long moment, sitting her horse in the last slanting gold of the afternoon. And then, because she had decided this weeks ago and had simply been waiting for the right moment, she said, "I know more than you think, Warren." The silence that followed was profound. He looked up at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, raw and startled and somehow terribly young, as though she had just stripped away 10 years of careful self-construction in a single sentence. He said nothing for a long time. The mare moved quietly in the corral behind him. Somewhere over the mountains a hawk cried. "How long?" he asked finally. "Since the first week," she said. "I grew up in Abilene. I was 16 when you were 20 and you came to church at Christmas and you helped load hay for the Whitfield horses, and I saw you perhaps a dozen times over 4 years, but your voice is not the kind that changes." He put both hands on the fence rail and looked down again. His knuckles were white. "And you have said nothing." "It was not my secret to tell," Martha said. He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said very slowly, as though testing the words, "You know my name, my real one, and you still rode out here to warn me instead of..." He stopped. "Instead of what?" she asked. "Using it against you, sending you off." She shook her head. "Warren Whitfield or Cole Reardon, you helped me move flood-damaged stock out of my storeroom without being asked, and you fixed my front porch steps, and you have been the most reliable conversation I have had since my father died. I do not much care what you called yourself before." He turned away from her, and she watched his shoulders move as he breathed, and she thought, "I have perhaps said too much, and he will be afraid of it." She prepared herself for the pulling back, the careful retreat, the renewed construction of walls. Instead, he turned back around and looked up at her with those amber eyes that had been honest from the very first day, even when nothing else about him was, and he said, "Would you get down off that horse, please? I have something I need to say to you, and I cannot say it with you on horseback and me down here." She dismounted. They stood on either side of the fence in the fading afternoon light, and he told her. He told her all of it, and she listened without interrupting, the way she always did, giving the silence all the room it needed. His name was Warren James Whitfield. In 1874, his older brother Daniel had entered into a cattle-buying arrangement with a man named Silas Croft, a man who turned out to be systematically defrauding the ranchers who sold to him, using false weights and manipulated accounts. Daniel Whitfield had trusted Croft, and because he trusted him, had recommended him to 3 other Abilene ranchers who consequently lost considerable money. When Croft's scheme came apart, Daniel had been implicated, not as an active participant, but as a man who had vouched for a fraudster and had perhaps benefited from the association without asking enough questions. Daniel had died before the full accounting could be made, a riding accident in the spring of 1875 that left Warren to face the community's anger and suspicion alone. The Whitfield name had become synonymous in Abilene with the Croft scandal, and while Warren himself had played no part in the scheme, had in fact tried to warn his brother twice that Croft's numbers did not add up. He could not make that defense audible above the noise of other people's losses. The family ranch had been sold to pay what debts could be proven. Warren had left Kansas in the fall of 1875 with a horse, $40, and a bone-deep conviction that his name was now a burden he could not afford to keep carrying. He had worked his way south and west, one ranch after another, building toward something he could not have named clearly at the time. He had arrived in Cimarron in April of 1878 calling himself Cole Reardon, and he had spent 3 months being careful, being quiet, building a small, ordinary life that was entirely his own, without the weight of a ruined name attached to it. When he finished, the sun was fully behind the mountains and the air had gone cool, and the first pale stars were beginning to show. Martha stood very still and let everything he had said settle into the landscape of what she had known and suspected, and found that it fit perfectly, that the shape of the story matched the shape of the man she had been watching for months. "What Croft did to those ranchers was unjust," she said. "What the town did to your family because of it was unjust in a different way. Blame given to people who did not earn it is a kind of theft." He exhaled slowly. "It is done now. I cannot undo any of it." "No," she agreed, "but you are here now, and the name you are carrying is one you built yourself with your own work in your own time. That is worth something considerable." He looked at her. "Cole Reardon is a name on paper," he said. "It does not have anything under it." "Then put something under it," Martha said simply. He was quiet for so long that she thought perhaps she had misread the whole thing, misread his feelings toward her, misread the particular quality of his attention, built a story in her own mind that the facts did not support. She was preparing herself for the dignified retreat of a woman who had misjudged. Then he said, "Martha, I have wanted to say something to you for 2 months, and I have talked myself out of it every time because I was not sure I had the right to say it while I was still carrying a borrowed name." She waited. "I believe," he said very carefully, very precisely, "that I am in love with you. I want you to know that this is not the kind of thing I say without meaning it. I have been watching you run your life and your business and your town for 3 months, and I think you are the most capable and honest and remarkable woman I have ever encountered, and I would very much like to build something with you if you will allow it." The night had come down around them fully now, and the stars over the Sangre de Cristos were fierce and bright, and Martha Turner stood in the cool dark with her heart beating in a way it had not beaten in a very long time, and she said, I believe I told you some time ago that I am aware of my own remarkableness." He laughed, a real laugh, the full, unguarded kind she had only heard from him once or twice, and it was the best sound she had heard in months. "You did," he said. "You also said you preferred men who told you something true. I did say that. This is the truest thing I have got," he said simply. She reached across the fence rail and took his hand, and he looked down at her hand in his with an expression of such careful, earnest wonder that she felt the full weight of what it had cost him to stand in his own skin and say an honest thing, and she tightened her grip and said, "Warren Whitfield, I have been waiting for you to say that since about the middle of June." He closed his fingers around hers. They stood there in the starlight for a long time, just holding on, and the horses moved peacefully in the corral, and the mountain stood dark against the sky, and Cimarron went about its nighttime business at a comfortable distance, and nothing happened at all except that two people who had been lonely for a long time stood together in the dark and did not feel lonely anymore. The matter of Raymond Tuck and whoever had sent him did not resolve itself immediately. Warren spent a careful week going about his work at Baxter's ranch with his eyes open and his mouth closed on the subject, and Martha kept her own ears sharp in the store, which was one of the finest intelligence-gathering operations in the territory by virtue of the fact that everyone needed salt and cornmeal, and she was an excellent listener. On the 8th day after Hattie Benson's warning, a man named Garrett Hollies arrived in Cimarron on a fresh horse. He was perhaps 50, lean and weathered, with the look of a man who had spent his life traveling between other people's problems and taking a percentage of the solution. He came into Turner's Dry Goods and bought a tin of tobacco and asked, in a pleasant, conversational way, whether a man named Warren Whitfield had passed through the territory in the last few years. Martha did not even blink. "I'm not familiar with that name," she said pleasantly. "We get a great many travelers. Is there a particular reason you are looking for him?" "Business matter," Holly said vaguely. "Family business." "Family," Martha said, making her voice sympathetic. "You might try the land office or the post office. Mrs. Benson at the post office knows most everyone in the county." She sent him to Hattie Benson, who was both the most formidable obstacle in Cimarron and, by virtue of her sharp assessment of people, one of Martha's most reliable allies when the situation called for it. That evening she rode out to Baxter's ranch again and told Warren about Garrett Hollies. He listened with his usual stillness, and then he said, "Hollies. I know that name. He worked for a land attorney in Topeka. He finds people who do not want to be found." "What does this attorney want with you?" Warren was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that surprised her. "I think," he said slowly, "that it might actually be good news. There was a man in Abilene, a banker named Amos Reedley, who believed me when I said I had tried to warn Daniel about Croft. He said at the time that if he could ever find evidence that cleared the Whitfield name properly, he would pursue it. I always thought it was a kind thing to say and nothing more." "You think this Hollies might be coming from Reedley?" Martha asked. "I think it is possible," Warren said. "I think I need to find out." This was a different kind of courage from riding away. This was the kind that required staying put, and Martha watched him decide to exercise it with something very close to pride. The next morning, Warren Whitfield walked into the Cimarron Hotel where Garrett Hollies was staying, sat down across from him at the breakfast table and said, "I understand you are looking for me." Hollies looked up from his eggs and then set down his fork with the deliberate care of a man who had just found something he had been searching for a considerable time. "Warren Whitfield," Hollies said. "The same." Hollies reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "Amos Reedley sends his compliments," he said, "and his apologies for taking this long." What the letter contained was this: Silas Croft, attempting a similar scheme in Missouri in 1876, had been caught and had, in the process of legal proceedings, given a full accounting of the Abilene operation that exonerated Daniel Whitfield completely. Daniel had not known about the manipulation of weights and accounts. He had been deceived as thoroughly as anyone else. The court record was now public, and Reedley, who had retained a copy and had spent 2 years tracking down Warren Whitfield to deliver it, had enclosed a formal letter of restitution that could be presented to any court in Kansas. Warren sat in the hotel dining room and read the letter twice, and Hollis ate his eggs and watched him with the patient expression of a man who had delivered enough complicated news to know when to keep quiet. When Warren came to find Martha that afternoon, he was carrying the letter, and the expression on his face was one she could not quite read, not happiness exactly, and not grief, but something between them, a kind of exhausted relief, the expression of a person who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has only just been permitted to set it down. He showed her the letter. She read it carefully, every word. "Your brother's name is cleared," she said. "Yes." "And yours." "And mine," he said, as though he were trying out the weight of it. She folded the letter and handed it back to him and looked at him with steady brown eyes. "Then you have a decision to make," she said. "What decision?" "Whether you go back to Kansas and reclaim what the Whitfield name is owed," she said, "or whether you stay here and build what you have been building." He looked at her for a long moment. "Those are not two separate decisions," he said quietly. "Not anymore." She understood what he meant. She understood it completely. "Then tell me what you want," she said. "I want to stay here," he said. "I want to have my name back, both of them, because Cole Reardon is the man I built and I am not ashamed of him. But I want to stay in Cimarron and I want to build a life here. With you, Martha, if that is what you want too." "I told you in June," she said, "that it was." "You told me in June that you had been waiting for me to say something," he corrected, and there was that quiet humor again, that half-smile. "You did not specify what you wanted." "I specified it sufficiently," Martha said. "You are going to have to learn to trust my precision." He stepped forward and kissed her, right there in the afternoon light outside Turner's Dry Goods, and it was the kind of kiss that was not tentative or exploratory but entirely certain, the kind that comes from a long period of suppressed wanting. And Martha put one hand flat against his chest and kissed him back with equal certainty, and two women walking on the opposite side of the street affected not to notice, which in Cimarron was the highest form of social grace. Frank Baxter, when Warren told him the full story, was quiet for a long moment and then said, "A man who works as well as you do and then turns out to have been honest all along is a particular kind of relief." He shook Warren's hand. "You keep the job. And for what it is worth, I would take a man named Cole Reardon or Warren Whitfield or anything in between, provided he turns up at sunrise and works till sunset and treats his horses well. You have done all of those things." Warren wrote back to Amos Reedley in Topeka, thanking him for the years of effort and the letter, and telling him that he intended to remain in New Mexico territory where he had made a life. He did not feel the need to return to Kansas. There was nothing in Kansas that needed him the way Cimarron did, and nothing in Kansas that looked like Martha Turner standing in her store in the morning light with ink on her fingers and a ledger open on the counter. The formal letter of exoneration he framed and put on the wall of the small room at Clara Hatch's boarding house, not because he needed to see it every day, but because he had earned the right to stop hiding from it. The courtship, once it was no longer a question, was everything a courtship in 1878 could be, and was not always allowed to be openly acknowledged, deeply felt, conducted with a combination of practical partnership and romantic joy that Martha thought was probably the finest balance she had ever encountered. They rode together on Sunday afternoons when the weather was good, and he mended her fence, and she fed him supper, and they sat on the porch in the long summer evenings talking about everything. His childhood in Kansas, her childhood in the same place from a different angle, her father's ambitions for the store, his mother, who had died when he was 12 and who he still thought about on clear days when the light was a particular quality of golden, the books they had both read and argued about with cheerful conviction, the future, which they had both been careful about naming for a long time, and were now able to describe with increasing specificity. He asked her to marry him in October, on a Sunday afternoon when they had ridden up into the hills above town, and were sitting on a flat rock looking out at the distance he loved, the long view that had brought him up here every evening since April. He did not have a ring yet because he wanted to ask first, which was, Martha thought, exactly the kind of man he was. He said, "Martha Turner. I came to Cimarron under a name that was not mine, and you knew my real one and you kept it safe for me, and I would like very much to give you a new one in return. Mine, whichever of them you prefer." Martha looked at him for a moment with the expression she reserved for things that were worth looking at properly. "I prefer both," she said. "You are both of them, but I will take the name." "Which one?" he asked. "Whitfield," she said without hesitating, "because that is the one that cost you something to keep, and I want to honor that." He put both hands on her face and she let him, looking at him steadily, and he said very quietly, "I love you, Martha. I want you to know that I have never said that to another woman in my life and meant it quite this completely." "I know," she said simply, "and I love you, Warren, both of you." He kissed her in the afternoon light with the mountains spread out behind them and the territory going gold and copper and red in every direction, and it was the most beautiful thing either of them could see. They were married in December, at the church in Cimarron, with Frank Baxter standing as witness for Warren and Hattie Benson, who had appointed herself to this role without being asked, and was accepted in it without argument, standing beside Martha. Clara Hatch cried, which she did at all weddings and was not apologetic about. The minister, a dry-humored man named Reverend Aldace, conducted the ceremony with warmth and efficiency, and when he came to the part where names were exchanged, Warren said his full name, Warren James Whitfield, in a clear, steady voice that carried to the back of the church, and Martha heard something in that voice that had not been there in April, a settledness, a completeness, like a key turning fully in a lock. Martha Turner became Martha Whitfield, and she kept her store with that name on the new sign Warren painted for her in the first week of their marriage, in good clear letters, Martha Whitfield, Dry Goods and Sundries, Est. 1876. She had insisted on both names in the listing, her old one and her new one, because she had built the store as a Turner and she would not pretend otherwise, and this was the kind of woman she was, which was, Warren had come to understand, one of the finest kinds available. They moved into the small house at the edge of town that Warren had spent 2 months rebuilding from a near-derelict structure he had purchased from a departing family for a modest sum. He had done most of the work himself, with help from Frank Baxter's other hands on the Sundays when Frank released them, and the result was a 3-room house that was solid and clean and entirely adequate, with a kitchen that Martha pronounced superior to any she had used, a main room with 2 large windows that let in the morning light, and a bedroom that looked east toward the mountains. She brought the piano from the store's back room, where it had been stored since her father's time, and had it carried to the main room, and on the first evening in the house she played it badly and joyfully while Warren sat in the chair by the window and watched her with an expression of uncomplicated happiness that she thought she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was cold and difficult in the territory, as winters often were, with heavy snow that closed the mountain passes and made the supply wagons irregular. Martha ran the store through it with her customary competence, keeping accounts carefully and extending credit to those families who needed it against the expected spring deliveries, a practice that cost her in the short term and built her the loyalty of half the county in the long one. Warren worked at the Baxter Ranch when conditions allowed and spent the storm days repairing the house further, adding shelving and small improvements with the patient craftsmanship that characterized everything he did. They read to each other in the evenings by the fire. They argued about books and about the proper management of credit, and about whether the weather vane should be replaced on the mercantile with something more ornamental, and they agreed about almost everything that mattered, which was perhaps the most reliable foundation a marriage could have. By February of 1879, Martha knew she was expecting a child. She told Warren on a Tuesday evening while the snow was coming down outside and the fire was good, and she had been sitting with the knowledge for 2 days, turning it over, feeling the shape of it. She had been waiting for the right moment, but there was no particular right moment for a thing like this, only the moment when the words arrived. She said, "Warren, we are going to have a child." He was across the room, reading. He looked up. He looked at her for a long moment with the careful, measuring look he had that always preceded something important. And then his face broke open in an expression she had not seen on him before, something completely unguarded and wholly joyful, and he was across the room in 3 steps and had her hands in his and was looking at her with eyes that were brilliant with something she recognized as the same feeling she had, the one that had no adequate word except wonder. "When?" he asked. "September, I think," she said. He brought her hands up and pressed his mouth to them, and she felt him breathe, a long, slow exhale of profound feeling, and he said, "Martha." In the quiet way he said her name when he meant it to carry everything he could not adequately put into other words. "I know," she said. "I feel it too." The spring of 1879 was magnificent. The territory came back from winter in the extravagant way it sometimes did, with more wildflowers than anyone could remember across the mesa, and the mountains showing the last of their snow against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Warren took on a small plot of land adjacent to the house and began breaking ground for a kitchen garden, a project he undertook with the same methodical care he brought to everything, reading about it first, talking to the ranchers who grew their own vegetables, getting the soil right before he put anything in it. Martha's business expanded in the spring as well. A new family arrived from Missouri, the Carmichael family, with 4 children and a determination to homestead, and they needed everything at once: tools, flour, seed, fabric, lamp oil, nails. She outfitted them largely on credit and added 2 new shelving units to accommodate the expanding stock she was ordering from Santa Fe. She hired a girl named Rosie Ferris, 14 years old and sharp as a tack, to help with the counter work in the busy hours, and found Rosie to be one of the finest investments she had made. The summer passed in the full-hearted way that good summers do when a person has something to look forward to, in the warm, ordinary architecture of daily life shared with someone you have chosen well. Warren came home from the ranch in the evenings, and Martha came home from the store, and they ate together and talked about the day and sat on the porch in the fading light. And it was the kind of contentment that did not announce itself loudly, but was present in everything, a steady warmth under the ordinary surface of things. There were also the particular conversations that pregnant women and their husbands have in the weeks before a child arrives about names and the future, and what kind of people they hope to be as parents. Warren had strong feelings about names, which Martha supposed was natural, given his history with them. He said that he thought a name should be one a child could grow into, should have weight to it but not burden, should mean something without being performative about it. "What was your father's name?" Martha asked one evening. "James," Warren said. "James William Whitfield. He was a good man, not a perfect man, but a good one. He worked hard and he was kind to his family and he tried to do right. I would be proud to have a son carry that." "James," Martha said, testing it. "James Whitfield. That sounds like a person who will be taken seriously." "What about your father?" Warren asked. "Elias," Martha said. "For a middle name, perhaps, James Elias Whitfield." Warren was quiet for a moment. "That is a good name," he said. "It carries both families." "That is the idea," Martha said. James Elias Whitfield arrived on a Wednesday morning in late September 1879 in the bedroom of the house at the edge of Cimarron while Clara Hatch attended, and Warren paced the length of the main room so many times that he wore a visible path in the boards. When Clara came to the door and told him he could come in, he stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at his wife in the morning light, holding a red-faced, furiously alive infant with more hair than newborns were generally expected to have. And Warren Whitfield, who had crossed a territory under a borrowed name and had learned to look at distance from hilltops and had been very careful about everything for a very long time, sat down on the edge of the bed and took his son in his arms and cried with a completeness that surprised him. Martha watched him hold James Elias with the same expression she had seen on his face when he told her he loved her, fully present, fully meant, and she thought, there is the whole of it, right there, all the distance he traveled to arrive at this morning. The town took to James Whitfield with the collective fondness that small towns develop for the children of people they have decided to claim. Hattie Benson brought a jar of honey and a set of hand-knitted booties within the hour, which was an astonishing achievement in practical terms. Frank Baxter sent a side of beef. Reverend Aldace called on a Thursday and remarked that the child had excellent lung capacity, which was considered a compliment. Even Raymond Tuck, who had started the whole business with Garrett Hollies by asking questions he should not have asked, came by the store with a shy look and a small carved wooden horse, which Martha accepted graciously and placed on the windowsill where the morning light caught it. Warren began in the winter of 1879, with James sleeping in the room next door, to give serious thought to what he wanted the next years to look like. He had been a ranch hand for 4 years, and he was good at it, but he was also good at other things, at fixing structures, at managing the kind of practical complexity that a working property required, at dealing with people plainly and fairly. Frank Baxter, reading these qualities with the shrewdness of a man who had been running a successful operation for 20 years, offered him a foreman's position in December of that year, with a corresponding increase in wages and a degree of autonomy that Warren had not expected. He talked it through with Martha, as he talked everything through with Martha, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them and James asleep in the next room. She asked the right questions and listened carefully to his answers, and at the end said, "You have been working for other people since you left Kansas. This is still working for someone else, but it is a different kind. It is working with responsibility and with your own judgment. That seems like a natural next step." "You think I should take it," he said. "I think you have already decided to take it," she said, "and you are asking me because you want to know that I see what you see in it." He smiled. "And do you? I see that it suits you," she said, "the way a good coat suits a man, not because it is the only coat available but because it was made for his particular shape." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Martha Whitfield," he said, with the warmth he always put into her name, her married name, which he had given her and she had taken, which between them was a whole history of its own. "I am a better man than I arrived here being." "You arrived here being a very good man," she said firmly. "You are just more comfortable in the skin of him now." He took the foreman position. He was excellent at it. Frank Baxter, who was approaching 60 and had been thinking about the future of the operation, began talking to Warren the following spring about something more substantial, a partnership arrangement that would give Warren a stake in the Baxter Ranch in exchange for managing its expansion. This was a slower and more complex conversation, one that extended through the spring and summer of 1880 and required several visits from a lawyer in Santa Fe, but it moved in the right direction and everyone involved knew it. Martha's store continued to grow with the town. Cimarron in 1880 was a different place from Cimarron in 1878, more settled, more permanent, with new families arriving regularly and the commerce of the territory finding its shape. She hired Rosie Ferris full-time when Rosie turned 16, recognizing in her the same practical intelligence and head for numbers that had carried Martha herself through the difficult years, and she began teaching the girl the full management of the books, because Martha was already thinking about what the store might become when it was not only hers. In the spring of 1881, James Whitfield was learning to walk in a determined, crash-and-recover style that made the whole house a minor obstacle course of soft landings and strategic furniture placement, and Martha was expecting their second child. "A girl, I think," Martha said one evening on the porch, in the warm May air, watching James navigate the porch steps under Warren's patient supervision. "You thought James was a girl," Warren reminded her mildly. "I thought he might be," Martha corrected. "This one I am more certain about. The second Whitfield arrived in October of 1881 and was, in fact, a girl. They named her Ruth Josephine, Ruth for the quality of steadfastness they both admired in the biblical name, and Josephine for Martha's mother, who had died when Martha was 12, and who had been, by all accounts, a woman of formidable grace and humor. Ruth Josephine Whitfield was from the beginning a serious child with enormous dark eyes and an expression of intent observation that her father found deeply familiar, being the same expression he had fallen in love with on her mother. Warren, holding his daughter for the first time, said to Martha, "She is looking at everything as though she is memorizing it." "She takes after her father," Martha said. "She takes after her mother," Warren said. "I learned to look carefully from watching you." The partnership with Frank Baxter was formalized in the winter of 1881, making Warren Whitfield a junior partner in what would eventually become Baxter and Whitfield Cattle and Livestock, a name that would appear on a wooden sign at the ranch gate the following spring. Frank was quietly delighted by this, being a man without children of his own who had recognized in Warren something of the son he had not had, and who found considerable satisfaction in watching the younger man take on the weight of something and carry it well. Warren, the first morning he rode out to the ranch as a part owner, stopped his horse at the gate and looked at the sign for a long moment. Martha had ridden out with him for this occasion, James in front of her on the saddle and Ruth in a carrier on her back, and she watched his face in profile against the morning light, and she knew what he was thinking, because she knew most of what he thought. He was thinking about the distance between the man who had ridden into Cimarron 3 years ago with a borrowed name and 40 careful words, and a habit of looking at the horizon, and this man here, on a November morning with a stake in the ground and a family, and a name he had earned twice over. "Warren," she said softly. He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the settled, whole kind of happiness that does not shout but is unmistakable, the kind that sits in the eyes and the set of the shoulders and the quality of a man's breathing. "I know," he said. "Good," she said, and clicked her horse forward through the gate. The years built on each other with the comfortable solidity of a well-made structure. The ranch grew under Warren's management, acquiring a reputation for quality horses and reliable cattle that carried the Baxter-Whitfield name well beyond Cimarron and into the wider territory trade. Warren was known as a fair dealer and a man whose word could be relied upon absolutely, and this reputation, built entirely from scratch in the territory without the benefit or burden of family history, was one he held with a quiet but unshakable pride. Martha's store continued to be the center of commercial life on Main Street, expanded now to include a wider stock and a small corner given over to the exchange of mail and messages, a function previously served by the post office, but which Hattie Benson had cheerfully ceded when her eyesight began to trouble her in 1882. Hattie still came in every day, not to work but to sit in the chair by the window and maintain her comprehensive knowledge of the community's affairs, which she considered a public service, and which Martha had long since accepted as one of the fixed features of her day. In 1883, a man arrived in Cimarron with a newspaper from Abilene, Kansas, left it on the counter of the store by accident, and rode on. Martha found it and set it aside, and when Warren came in that evening she handed it to him without comment and watched him look through it with careful eyes. The Croft case was referenced in a legal column, in passing, as a settled matter of public record. The names it mentioned were historical now, belonging to something concluded. Warren folded the paper and set it down and was quiet for a moment, and then he looked at Martha and said, "It is over." "It has been over," she said gently. "It has been over since you named our son after your father." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, That the moment you gave James the name he carries, you stopped being a man who was hiding from his history. You became a man who was making a new chapter of it. The newspaper is just confirmation of what has already been true for years. He came around the counter and kissed her forehead with the particular tenderness he reserved for the moments when she said the thing that went directly to the center of what he had been feeling, and she closed her eyes and let him. And when she opened them, he was looking at her with the full attention she had loved from the very beginning. "You have an extraordinary mind," he said. "I have an extraordinary husband," she said, "who occasionally needs to be reminded of his own progress." "Only occasionally," he agreed. Their life in Cimarron in those years had the texture of something genuinely built, not merely found or fallen into, but constructed with deliberate effort and care. The house had grown with them. A second room added on the eastern side when Ruth was born. A proper barn for the horses added in 1882 when Warren acquired 2 fine animals of his own. A kitchen garden that had become a substantial vegetable plot under Warren's methodical attention, and produced more in summer than they could use themselves, the surplus going to neighbors and to families who were newly arrived and not yet fully established. James Whitfield at 4 years old was a serious, curious boy who followed his father everywhere and asked questions at a rate that would have exhausted a lesser man, but which Warren answered with unfailing patience, because he believed, as Martha did, that a child who wanted to know things should be given the information. Ruth at 2 was developing the focused observational quality her parents had noted from birth, and also a forthright willingness to express opinions that no one had quite anticipated. Opinions about the placement of objects, the quality of food, the appropriateness of clothing, delivered in a clear 2-year-old's voice with an authority that made Clara Hatch dissolve into helpless laughter whenever she witnessed it. The territory around them was changing, as the territory always was in those years, always pushing toward a complexity it had not had before. The Santa Fe Railroad had reached many points south and east, and while Cimarron itself remained somewhat remote, the commerce it enabled changed the flow of goods and people through the region. New families arrived. New businesses opened. A schoolhouse was built in 1882, a real one with a proper teacher brought from Missouri. A young woman named Alice Greer, who was 23 and formidably educated, and who took to the children of Cimarron with an intensity of purpose that the whole town found both admirable and slightly alarming. Martha served on the school board from its first meeting, because of course she did, and Warren provided 2 loads of lumber for the building at cost, because of course he did, and Alice Greer ate Sunday dinner at the Whitfield table within the first month of her arrival, because Martha had made it her business to ensure that the teacher had at least one reliable meal each week that did not come from the boarding house. Alice Greer and Martha Whitfield became, within 6 months, the kind of friends who do not need to explain themselves to each other, which was extremely good for both of them and also for the school board, which benefited from their combined determination. It was Alice Greer who first noticed that Raymond Tuck's children, 3 of them, were not attending school regularly. Raymond Tuck had never been a man of considerable standing in Cimarron, and his children were shy and thin, and arrived when they did arrive in clothes that were inadequate for the mountain cold. Alice brought this to Martha's attention one November morning, and Martha brought it to Warren's attention that evening, and Warren, who understood something about the way circumstances could hem a family in, had a quiet conversation with Raymond Tuck that resulted in the children appearing in school every day thereafter, and in Raymond Tuck having a steady job mending fences for the Baxter Whitfield operation. It was not a dramatic intervention, and no one spoke of it publicly, but Raymond Tuck, who had once knocked on doors asking questions about Warren Whitfield for strangers who paid him, came to the Whitfield house in the spring and said simply that he was grateful, and Warren shook his hand. This was the kind of man Warren Whitfield had become in Cimarron, and Martha saw it clearly and loved what she saw. In the spring of 1884, when James was 4.5 and Ruth was 2.5 and the house was full and loud and warm with children and horses and neighbors, and the general productive chaos of a good life, Martha told Warren she thought there might be a third child arriving in the autumn. He received this information in the way he received all information that mattered to him, with complete stillness, and then a kind of radiant openness, like a country after rain, everything bright and waiting. 3, he said. 3, she agreed. Your store, he said, with the practical attentiveness she had loved from the beginning. We should think about, I have thought about it, she said. Rosie Ferris can manage the floor work and I will be there for the accounts. I did the same with Ruth. I know how to manage. You know how to manage everything, he said, which was both true and the kind of thing she never got tired of hearing from him. The third child arrived in October 1884, a second son, which James received with a 4-year-old's proprietary consternation, and Ruth received with the equanimity of a philosopher. They named him Daniel, for Warren's brother, who had been wrongly suspected and had died before he could be vindicated, and whose name Warren had carried in his heart through all the years of his own enforced anonymity. Daniel Elias Whitfield was a large and cheerful baby who cried very seldom and slept extremely well, qualities his parents regarded as miraculous and his siblings regarded as irrelevant. On the night of Daniel's birth, after Clara Hatch had gone home and the children were settled and the house was quiet, Warren sat beside Martha in the lamplight of the bedroom, his sleeping son in the crook of his arm, and he said something he had been thinking about for a long time. I want to tell you something, he said quietly. Then tell me, she said. She was tired and content, propped on pillows, watching him hold their son. When I rode into Cimarron in April of 1878, he said slowly, I thought the best I could hope for was to disappear, to be small and quiet and unremarkable enough that whatever I had been before would not be able to find me. I thought the life I wanted, the real one, had already happened to me and I had lost it, and what was left was just the shape of a life, going through the motions. Martha was quiet, listening. And then you handed me a pound of flour, he said, and you said, in that voice you have, that coal was a solid name and easy to say, and something in the way you said it, I do not know. It was like hearing someone knock on a door I had bricked up. I did not know then what it meant, but I knew something. What did you know? She asked softly. That you already knew, he said. I did not know that you literally knew not then, but I knew that you were not fooled, that whatever I was pretending to be you could see around it to whatever was actually there, and that was, he paused. It was the most frightening thing that had happened to me since Kansas, and also the best. Martha reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the baby's blanket. I saw a man who was carrying something heavy and carrying it with dignity, she said. That is what I saw. The name on top did not obscure any of it. You said you preferred the man behind it, he said. You said that to me on the porch at Clara's, that you preferred the man behind the name. I did, she said. I meant it absolutely. I know, he said. I have known it for 6 years. I just want you to know that it was the right thing, staying here, building this, it was the right thing. Warren, she said with gentle certainty. I have known that since about the middle of June, 1878. He laughed, the full unguarded laugh she had always loved, and Daniel stirred slightly in his arm and resettled, and Ruth murmured in her sleep in the next room, and James made the indeterminate sound of a child deep in dreaming, and the house was full of the breathing of people who were safe and warm and known to each other, and the fire was good and the night was quiet, and Warren Whitfield, who had ridden into this territory under another man's name and had been found by a woman with steady brown eyes and ink-stained fingers, held his third child and looked at his wife and thought, this is what it looks like, the life you thought you had already missed. The years continued to build. The school in Cimarron grew under Alice Greer's tenacious management, and by 1886 it had 2 rooms and 2 teachers, and James Whitfield was in the first cohort of students who had attended from the very beginning, a fact that Alice considered one of her finest achievements. Warren and Frank Baxter, expanded the operation to include a breeding program for working horses that attracted buyers from as far as Colorado, and the Baxter Whitfield name became known in the wider livestock trade as a mark of quality and reliability. Martha's store, Turner Whitfield Dry Goods and Sundries as it was listed in the county commercial register, had become indispensable in a way that went beyond the provision of flour and coffee and work gloves. It was the place where the community found itself, where news was traded and credit was extended, and disputes were quietly arbitrated, and newcomers were measured and found to be people worth knowing. Martha ran it with the same precision and warmth she had always brought to it, and Rosie Ferris, now 22 and formidably capable, ran the floor operations with a skill that Martha watched with considerable pride, thinking of her own younger self, thinking of the woman who had taken on a store and a debt and a territory that did not always treat women gently and had built something lasting from it. On a Tuesday evening in May of 1887, Warren came home from the ranch to find Martha in the kitchen with all 3 children at the table, James doing his schoolwork with an expression of focused concentration that made his father's chest tighten with recognition, Ruth drawing something elaborate on a piece of paper that she would not show anyone until it was finished, and Daniel, 2.5, making a careful investigation of a wooden spoon. Martha was at the stove, and the kitchen smelled of beef stew and cornbread, and the evening light was coming through the window at the particular angle it had in May that turned everything it touched to gold. Warren stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at all of it. Martha looked over her shoulder and saw him standing there and said, "You are going to let all the warm air out." He came in and closed the door and kissed her at the stove, which James noted with the elaborate disdain of a 7-year-old, and Ruth noted with the focused interest of a 5-year-old, and Daniel noted by banging his wooden spoon on the table. "Good day?" Martha asked. "Good day," Warren said. He picked up Daniel and put the boy on his hip and leaned against the counter beside her. The Henderson mare foaled, bay colt, no markings, legs like he borrowed them from a different horse. "Is he all right?" Martha asked. "Perfect," Warren said. "Better than perfect. The kind of animal that makes you remember why you do the work." She smiled and turned back to the stove, and he stood beside her holding their youngest child, and the evening settled into the warm, particular shape it always had, supper and the fire and the voices of children, and the uncomplicated pleasure of being exactly where you had chosen to be with the people you had chosen to be there with. Hattie Benson, presiding over the social life of Cimarron from her chair by the window of Turner Whitfield Dry Goods, was heard to remark that spring that the Whitfields were the kind of family a town built itself around, which was, coming from Hattie, the highest possible praise, and which Martha received with the same steady, unsentimental grace she brought to everything. She told Warren what Hattie had said that evening on the porch, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he hoped Hattie was right, that he hoped they were the kind of people who contributed something to the place they had been given. "You fixed the church steps last September," Martha said, unsolicited. "They needed fixing," he said. "You built 3 families' fence lines in the spring drought of 1885 when they could not afford to hire it done. It needed doing. You have been teaching Billy Carmichael to ride every Saturday morning for 6 months at no charge because his father has a bad leg. He is a good boy and he learns fast," Warren said. "Warren Whitfield," Martha said, in the tone she used when he was being deliberately obtuse about something. "You are a good man. Accept it." He looked at her with those amber eyes that had given him away from the very first week, in spite of everything, and he said, "I learned from good examples." She took his hand and they sat together in the May evening on the porch of the house they had built together. In the town they had made their own, and the mountain stood in the last of the light, and the whole of what they had built spread around them in every direction, children and work and friendship, and the accumulated years of a life made carefully and truly. And the distance Warren had always loved to look at was still there on the horizon, the long view south and west, infinite and clear. But it was no longer something he needed to escape to. He was already where he wanted to be. A letter arrived from Topeka in June of 1887, from Amos Reedley's law firm, now run by his son after Amos himself had died in 1885. The letter was brief and cordial. It noted that the firm maintained records on the Whitfield exoneration, should Warren ever wish to return to Kansas and pursue any formal claim against the properties sold in 1875. It was, the younger Reedley wrote, the firm's position that a man who had been wrongfully disadvantaged by public circumstance deserved the opportunity to reclaim what had been taken from him by means other than his own fault. Warren read the letter at the kitchen table and passed it to Martha without comment, and she read it and looked at him. "Do you want to go back?" she asked directly, because she had never learned to ask questions sideways and did not intend to start. He thought about it seriously, which was the respect the question deserved. He thought about Kansas, about the flat green country and the cattle smell of Abilene and his father's grave, and the house where he had grown up and the grave of a brother who had been wronged and had not lived to know it. He thought about all of that, and he thought about Cimarron in the May light, and the bay colt with legs like borrowed property, and Ruth drawing in the lamplight and James frowning over his schoolwork and Daniel and his wooden spoon. "No," he said. "There is nothing in Kansas I need that I have not built here." Martha folded the letter and set it on the table and put her hand on top of his. "Then we are staying," she said. "We are staying," he confirmed. She wrote back to the Reedley firm in her precise, clear hand, thanking them for their courtesy and noting that Mr. Whitfield was settled in New Mexico territory and did not intend to return to Kansas, and that the family was well, and that the matter could be considered concluded. She sealed the letter and gave it to Rosie Ferris to go with the morning's outgoing mail, and then she went back to the books with the completeness of a woman who has drawn a line under something and is ready to turn the page. That summer, Frank Baxter passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 64, which was a great sadness in Cimarron and in the wider ranch country, and which left Warren as the principal owner of what became, after the legal arrangements were settled, the Whitfield Livestock and Cattle Company. Frank had left his share of the operation to Warren directly, a provision in his will that had been in place since the partnership's formation, because Frank Baxter was a man who planned ahead, and because he had decided years earlier that Warren Whitfield was the person he trusted to carry what he had built. Warren stood at Frank's grave on a July morning with his hat in his hands and the territory sky enormous above him, and he thought about all the things Frank had given him: work and dignity, and the particular faith of a man who looked at you and saw what you could become rather than only what you presently were. And he said, quietly, just to the air and the grass and the mountains, "I will take care of it." Martha stood beside him with her hand in his and said nothing, because she knew this was a conversation he needed to finish on his own. The Whitfield Livestock and Cattle Company became, over the following years, one of the more respected operations in northern New Mexico territory, known for its horses above all, the quality of breeding that Warren had developed with Frank's early guidance and his own considerable gift. Cowboys came from across the territory for Whitfield horses, and the spring sale at Cimarron became a regular event on the regional livestock calendar, drawing buyers and breeders and the lively commerce that attended such occasions. James Whitfield at 8 years old could ride anything that would let him on it, which was the subject of considerable parental discussion and some maternal anxiety, and a great deal of paternal pride poorly concealed. Ruth at 6 had decided she was going to be a teacher when she was grown, an ambition she communicated to Alice Greer directly, who responded with enthusiasm and began giving Ruth additional reading lessons on Saturday mornings. Daniel at 3 had no discernible ambitions except the accumulation of interesting rocks, in which project he was supported by his father, who had a genuine appreciation for the geological character of the territory. In the spring of 1889, Martha discovered she was expecting again. She was 37 years old, and she received this information with the serene practicality of a woman who had done this 3 times before and knew what it required of her. Warren received it with the same radiant openness he always had, which made Martha think, as she often did about him, that he was one of those people who remained genuinely capable of being glad about things, who had not had that capacity worn away by accumulation or habit. The fourth child was another girl, born in November of 1889, and they named her Clara, for Clara Hatch, who had attended all 4 births and who received the news of the naming with a quality of emotion that she took several minutes to recover from, and then denied entirely, claiming something had gone into her eye. Clara Whitfield was from the beginning a person of considerable energy and volume, the kind of baby who announced herself clearly and the kind of child who would, everyone agreed, be a force to reckon with when she achieved her full height. Daniel, at 4, regarded his new sister with the philosophical resignation of a youngest child who has been displaced and is determining how to feel about it. He was won over within a week by Clara's absolute and uncompromising interest in everything he did, an interest that she maintained for the rest of her life. The house, which had grown twice already, grew again that winter, a proper nursery added to the eastern end, and a second parlor that had been theoretical for years and became actual because Warren and 2 of the ranch hands spent 3 weeks of the late autumn building it. And Martha stood in the new room in December, looking at the 4 walls and the windows and the evening light coming in at the correct angle, and thought, "This is the house we deserve, the one we built slowly and fully, room by room and year by year." New Mexico Territory was moving, in the late 1880s, toward statehood, a process that was slow and politically complicated, and that was felt in places like Cimarron as a kind of gravitational shift, a sense that the country around them was settling into something more permanent. Warren attended the county meetings on the subject and served on a committee that had no official standing but considerable practical influence, alongside the other established ranchers and businessmen of the region. He brought Martha's views to these meetings, because her views were usually sharper than anyone else's, and she was not always able to attend herself, and she gave him careful and sometimes pointed summaries of what she thought needed saying. He said her words at those meetings in his own voice, and afterward reported back the responses, and they sat at the kitchen table and assessed the proceedings together. And this was, Martha thought, a very satisfactory form of political participation for a woman in 1889, even if it was not yet the form she would have preferred. "Someday," she said to Warren on a November evening, with Clara asleep on her chest and the 3 older children visible through the doorway doing their various evening things, "women will vote on these matters themselves." "I believe you are right," Warren said, and meant it, because he had never in his life had any reason to believe that Martha Turner Whitfield's opinions about anything were less worth hearing than any man's, and considerable evidence to the contrary. "I know I am right," she said, in the comfortable tone of a woman stating a fact rather than arguing a position. "It is only a matter of time." He reached across and touched Clara's small head gently and looked at his wife and said, "Whatever time it takes, the world will be better for it." She looked at him with the steady brown eyes that had known him from the beginning, known his name before he offered it, known the man behind the borrowed identity and preferred him to any careful construction, and she thought, "I have built my life with the right person. I have built it in the right place, with the right children in the right years, and I would not trade a single day of any of it." Cimarron in 1890 was a different town from the one Martha had inherited with the store and the debt and the dignity of a woman alone, and she had been part of the making of that difference, which was something she held quietly and without vanity. The store was thriving, the house was full, the ranch was respected, the children were well. Alice Greer's school had graduated its first class of students who had attended all the way through, and James Whitfield was among them, a fact that made both his parents sit in the school's small ceremony with the particular stillness of people who are feeling something too large for easy expression. Warren, sitting beside Martha at that ceremony in May of 1890, reached over in the middle of Alice Greer's address and took Martha's hand, and she laced her fingers through his without looking at him, keeping her eyes on their son, who was sitting in the front row with the other graduates in their best clothes, looking at the world with his father's amber eyes and his mother's steady attention. After the ceremony, when the graduates had received their certificates, and the community had eaten the cake that Clara Hatch had organized with her usual military efficiency, Warren found James on the edge of the crowd and stood with him for a moment, just the two of them, and said, "Your grandfather James would have been proud of you today." James, 12 years old and already nearly as tall as his father, looked up at Warren with a directness that was entirely his mother's. "Tell me about him," he said. "You don't talk about him very often." "No," Warren said after a moment. "I should talk about him more. He was a good man. He worked hard and he was fair, and he raised Daniel and me to believe that your word and your work were the two things nobody could take from you." He paused. "He was right about that. I found it to be true." James considered this with the seriousness he brought to things. "Is that why you named Daniel after Uncle Daniel?" he asked. "Because you wanted to remember him?" "Yes," Warren said, "because he deserved to be remembered rightly. He was wrongly accused of something and it followed him, and I did not want his name to just disappear. Your brother carries it forward." James was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you came here with a different name?" he asked very directly, because he was 12 and he had been fitting pieces together for a year or two. Warren looked at his son. "Yes," he said, because James deserved an honest answer and was old enough to understand one. "I was trying to put down a name that had been damaged, through no fault of mine or Daniel's, but through the actions of another man. I came here to start again. And here I found everything worth having, starting with your mother, who saw through the whole business in about a week and was too kind to say so for 4 months. James smiled, a slow smile with his mother's quality of amusement in it. "She told me she figured it out when you asked for flour," he said. Warren looked across the crowd to where Martha was talking to Alice Greer, Ruth at her side, and Daniel pulling at her skirt for attention and Clara on her hip, Martha managing all of it with the natural ease of a woman who had been managing considerable complexity for 14 years. She looked up at that moment and caught his eye across the distance, and smiled, a full and private smile that was entirely for him, and he felt the weight of it, the warmth of it, the way he always had from the very beginning. "Your mother," Warren said to his son, "knew my name before I gave it to her, and she kept it safe for 4 months, and she wrote out to warn me when there was trouble coming, and she told me she preferred the man behind the borrowed name. She has been the best and wisest and most reliable person I have ever known, and I want you to remember, all of you, that your mother built this life as much as I did, and what she built is worth a very great deal." James looked at his father and then at his mother across the crowd, and then back at his father, and he said, with the precision of a boy who had been raised by two people who both believed in saying things exactly, "I know, Papa. We all know." Warren put his hand on his son's shoulder, and they stood together in the May morning with everything they had made around them, and it was sufficient, and more than sufficient, and entirely right. Martha Whitfield ran Turner Whitfield Dry Goods for another 20 years, and in that time she trained Rosie Ferris so thoroughly that when Rosie married and then widowed and then took over the store in 1905, the transition was seamless, and both women considered it a success. Warren ran the Whitfield Livestock and Cattle Company with a steadiness and quality of reputation that made it the kind of operation younger men pointed to when they talked about what it was possible to build from nothing in the territory. James eventually joined him in the operation, and Daniel went east to study law, a choice that made his mother quietly delighted and that his father supported without reservation. Ruth became a teacher, as she had announced at age 6 she intended to do, and taught at the Cimarron school for 15 years under Alice Greer, and then, when Alice retired as its principal. Clara grew up exactly as energetic and considerable as predicted, and eventually married a surveyor who was surveying the eastern boundary of the territory, and who had the good sense to recognize what he had found when he met her. Warren and Martha grew old in Cimarron, in the house that had grown room by room with their family, on the same street where Martha had first handed a cautious man a pound of flour and noticed something in the quality of his hesitation. They grew old with the particular grace of people who have been happy for a long time and know it, who have not taken the happiness for granted but have tended it deliberately, have chosen it over and over in all the ordinary daily ways that choice is available. On an evening in the autumn of some year well into the new century, when the children were grown and the house was quieter than it had been in a long time, and the mountains were showing their first snow, and the light was the particular gold of late afternoon in September, Warren and Martha sat on the porch they had rebuilt together in 1885 and looked at the town below them and the mountains beyond and the sky above, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. "You fixed this porch," Martha said, running her hand along the rail. "Twice," Warren said. "The first time was before you even told me what you were really called," she said. "I know," he said. "I was hoping that would count for something." "It did," she said. He took her hand, as he had taken it on the night of their first real conversation, as he had taken it 1,000 times in the years between, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat in the evening light of the territory they had claimed and been claimed by, and the distance he had always loved to look at lay spread before them, clear and beautiful and utterly familiar, the horizon belonging to both of them now, belonging to all of them, to the children and the grandchildren already beginning to arrive, to the town that had held them, to the life that had been possible because a woman with ink-stained fingers had seen through a borrowed name to the man behind it and had decided, without hesitation, that she preferred him. "Warren Whitfield," Martha said softly. "Martha Whitfield," he said, as he always said it, with the warmth of everything it contained. "I am glad you came to the territory," she said. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to it and looked at her in the evening light with eyes that had been honest from the very first day, even when nothing else about him was, and he said, "I am glad there was a woman here who already knew my name." The mountain stood in the last of the light, permanent and patient, and the town below them settled into its evening rhythms, and the porch was solid beneath them, and the stars were beginning to show, and everything was resolved and right and whole. The long story of a borrowed name and the woman who had kept it safe arrived at its full and proper conclusion, which was not an ending at all but the settled, luminous permanence of a life completely made.